My interview subject in this edition of Tom Jordan's Got Issues. He has mentored many a Ron Burgundy in his days. In fact, he still does. A behind-the-scenes, decades-long news executive who has remained a major force in the local news industry all across the country, and the stories he has to tell in this edition of Tom Jordan's Got Issues.
You thought you had issues?
You've been shot at in a train wreck.
I love my country.
Wait until you hear this.
I required that as a requirement.
1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yeah.
She calls you a liar. This is, I gotta shake it up.
I can't lie about facts.
Tom Jordan?
Great to be with you, Tom.
You don't strike me as someone who's clutching your pearls.
Major issues there.
I don't have pearls.
Tom Jordan's Got Issues.
Yeah, a lot of news people have got some issues. Believe me, I know. Myself included. You know, the TV news business has changed dramatically over the decades. Since the 1970s, the 1980s, 1990s, behavior in the newsrooms of decades past didn't necessarily mirror the presentation of the news on the broadcast. You know, some shocking things that occurred off air were subsequently kept close to the vest amongst insiders. You know, things like the anchor stumbling into a news studio just mere minutes before airtime, being assisted into a chair behind a brightly lit news desk, the floor director counting down from 10, 5 seconds, hoping the guy's going to pull this off, only to watch, astounded at the flawless presentation of this news anchor that just spent maybe the past few hours prior to this out at some place with some late broadcast activities that might not lend themselves to doing well, but they pulled it off night after night in some cases. Not everybody. You know, people were fired back then on the spot for a poorly written sentence, while others with slanderous and unspeakable comments that were made in newsrooms ended up having illustrious careers. For a time, it always comes back one way or the other. There were things like blatant discrimination, tragedies, heartache, and regret. I've talked to many people in this news business, especially when I started out as a young man in my 20s, with people that I grew up watching, only to get to know them as I worked with them and to hear their stories of personal tragedy and regret. Most of them had an insatiable desire for and a tightly held grip on this craft of broadcast journalism. It's addictive somewhat in its nature. And through it all, there's also this strange camaraderie in the news business. It still exists today. My guest today has seen all that and then some, and he put much of it in his new book. It's aptly titled, Enough to be Dangerous. Mort Meisner, he is the author of the book. He is now one of the nation's top talent agents for news anchors, reporters, television weathercasters, sports anchors, and more. And I went to his office just outside of Detroit, and here's our very intriguing conversation. And you are the author of a brand new book.
Yeah, I am. Enough to be Dangerous, which I collaborated on with Stephanie Rupp, Ruopp.
Who's Stephanie Rupp?
Stephanie is a young woman who does a lot of writing and blogging for me, and I met her in a coffee shop, which is better than the previous would-be writer I met, who, after I engaged her, called me one day from Moscow and said, "Can I work on the book from Moscow?" I said, "No."
Not Moscow, Idaho. Moscow
no.
in Russia.
And not Moscow Mule.
There's another one.
Yeah.
Now, so you got this writer. I'm just curious, as you brought this up, was the one that helped you write the book, was she shocked and surprised, or what was the reaction to all the stories that came out from this book and from your life experience, not in just the news business, but in rock and roll, and also your personal life?
Well, part of the personal life, she was sad, but although unlike me, she came from a very well-to-do family, but has had a lifelong battle with sadness, depression, much the same as I have. But she was fun. I mean, she was really engaged with all the stories and felt that truth was stranger than fiction.
It is. But I think also when you dive into people's lives, you begin to understand that everybody has issues, and sometimes they can be very deep and they can be hidden by a lot of things.
Yeah.
Now, you've worked in the news business, you've worked with a lot of different personalities, and there is this veneer that is, I guess, portrayed, at least to the public, from people in television news, which is what your experience is really prominently from, was
Right.
TV news. But underneath the surface, you dig a little bit, there's a lot of tough things that have happened. The title of the book, Enough to Be Dangerous, the title of that book, where did that come from? And why do you have enough information on people to be kind of dangerous?
Yeah, I think, I was mostly dangerous to myself during the years that I engaged using cocaine from, 1981 to 1989. But, and some of the situations I got in, but Enough to Be Dangerous also was a little tongue-in-cheek as well, and I have to give credit. The title was suggested by my 27-year-old son, Mort Meisner.
He grew up in your house.
And he grew up, so I'm not sure what that means.
He just knew you knew a lot of stuff,
Yes.
and you're a dangerous guy if you want to be. You grew up in the news business professionally. You became very successful in the 70s, 80s,
Yeah.
and in the 90s.
Yeah.
Before you branched out and started your own agency, which you're very successful in as well, related to the news business.
Yes.
When you look back, to those different decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, how was the news business and the people that were in the news business back then different than they are today?
Well, on one hand, when I first started, there was film, which for people not in the industry, you have to develop in what we called the soup, before it could go on the air. Often it would break or the soup would eat it, and there was no film at 11
Right.
when that happened. And then live technology came in, so deadlines, instead of being 5 o'clock, were right now. So that was one way. I also think that the media, in many ways, is as aggressive as it used to be, but is more careless than it's ever been. I think fact-checking, we need to do a better job of fact-checking when we put stories on the air.
Why do they do that? Why are they more careless now and possibly less accurate than they were back then?
One reason is we have too many young men and women running newsrooms who have maybe spent 2 years in Pocatello, Idaho, and they get to maybe Detroit or Milwaukee. So that's one, lack of experience. But there's also tremendous pressure by the corporations that own these news operations to do more with less. And I learned at an early age in the industry, it's more important to be right than first.
But nowadays, being first is critical because you're dealing with seconds thanks to social media. I can remember years ago when they called it citizen journalism, when it was just coming on the scene. YouTube had just been started, I think, and I was covering a campaign. It was the Mitt Romney campaign when he was going up against John McCain. I think this was 2008. And some guy with a camera just came up to me and started asking me questions, about citizen journalism. Do you think it's ever going to succeed? And what do you think, Mr. Jordan? And I answered, I said, well, are you on YouTube? Is that what you do? He goes, yeah. I said, well, I think it's, kind of neat that you're out there doing. I did not think it would get to the level, maybe I didn't have the foresight back then, to where it is right now, where it's powerful. And it has, to what extent do you think social media has influenced the news media?
Incredibly, and one of the real negative byproducts is whether you're on the right, on the left, or in the middle. So much of social media is opinion. It's bloggers,
Yes.
and a lot of people think it is fact, and they'll hear something on Fox or they'll hear something on CNN that's clearly opinion that maybe is fueled by social media. And they don't realize it, and they repeat it as fact.
On the news broadcast,
Yeah.
they're repeating these things that have been tweeted out,
Yes.
without verifying it. I mean, you look back to 70s and 80s.
Yes.
The Nixon situation back in the 70s, they had to make sure their sources were ironclad.
Yes.
So you had this perception in the public that back then the news media was trustworthy, and they were above board, and that was the perception broadcast out. But then for people that worked in the industry back then, like you did,
Yeah.
underneath, we talked about the veneer, underneath that veneer, or that surface of objectivity and professionalism, there were a lot of chaotic personalities in newsrooms.
Yes.
You mentioned your struggles with cocaine, drugs. How rampant was that in newsrooms?
Super rampant. More so, I left here to go to CBS News and then ABC News, the networks, in 1981. And had been working here at WXYZ. There was some marijuana. I never saw cocaine here in the newsrooms. And we had some crazy, personalities. Bill Bonds, who later, acknowledged he would imbibe in that. But in the newsrooms in Chicago, rampant. I mean, incestuous, relationships from newsroom to newsroom, whether it was sex, drugs, alcohol. I was told on my first day at ABC, I was greeted by an executive producer by the name of Michael Sullivan. And he said, and I was his boss, he said, "Morty, welcome to ABC News. You'll get along here just fine if you're willing to, slang word for sex, have a lot of sex, drink a lot, and snort a lot of coke." That I'd been in the newsroom less than 5 minutes, and that was my greeting. It was rampant.
And was there a lot of pressure to keep it quiet on the outside? What was happening behind closed doors?
Yeah, there was that pressure, but behind closed doors, and this is something I'll say I never did, even I had my limits. There were co-managers of mine that were snorting cocaine behind locked doors. I mean, it happened. When one of my counterparts would say, "I'm going to be tied up in a meeting," and he'd wink at me, and then he'd come out like his butt was on fire. Well, he had been snorting cocaine. One such person got caught with cocaine in his desk, was fired, and this is at CBS, and sometime later, not too much later, was hired as Dan Rather's executive producer for the CBS Evening News.
So it didn't follow him to other newsrooms necessarily.
Correct. It did not. And but sometimes the myths would become greater than the reality. Rumors. There were rumors about me that were, I made enough mistakes on my own,
right,
without rumors. But there was a lot of rumors, but I wouldn't trade my experiences. I would change some of the mistakes I made, though.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of your mistakes, because you're open about it. You decided to be open about it. Before you were open about it publicly, you had to be even more open about it on a personal level. You had to speak with your family. You have kids. You had to talk with them and let them know what Dad was doing back then. How hard was that? Yeah,
it was hard. It was difficult. It came to my attention. My wife told me, Mark, my 27-year-old son, has been disappointed in you. And I'm thinking, oh, why? Well, apparently Jason, your older son, my older son from a previous marriage, told Mark some years ago, maybe 5 years ago, that Dad had a cocaine issue in the 80s. Well, Mark saw that as very hypocritical because of how much I preached against drugs. And I was sad, brought tears to my eyes. Hell, it made me cry. So I decided I would call a family meeting. Everyone was in the meeting. I said, look, and I explained the reasons why I did what I did. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I said, I'm going to tell you right now everything that I can recall that I did wrong. And it was cleansing, coming clean about it. I don't know that it made them feel good, bad, or indifferent, but Mark came up and hugged me and thanked me for my honesty. And then it allowed me to write this book, collaborate with Stephanie, and tell the truth. But one thing I'm really proud of is that I throw nobody under the bus for their bad behavior or for my bad behavior. I accept and embrace full responsibility.
Okay, so you bring up a very good and important point, because we are living in an era right now where it is fashionable and expected to point out the faults of others.
Right.
Without coming clean. So it doesn't matter if it's politics anymore. It could be in the entertainment industry.
Yeah.
You're not running for office, but you're this
Yeah.
person. I'm going to expose what you did
Yeah.
20, 30, 40 years ago. And on top of exposing it, I'm not going to forgive you. That's kind of the sentiment we see in our culture right now.
It is.
What you did was you turned those, you got one finger pointing at some of the 3 point. You turned those fingers on yourself.
I did.
And that ended up bringing healing not only to you, it sounds like you became free as a result, but there was seemingly restoration in your relationships.
There
To-
were.
to a degree.
But I will say, I was able to, quote, come clean, so to speak, with the help of a therapist, a psychiatrist I see, and I discovered I had a lot of repressed memories, and as we sit here today, I mean, there was a point I couldn't say the D word. I battled depression, and I try to do it without medication too. Not sure why. Maybe I'm not that smart, but it's
Stigma. I'm on medication.
It's
maybe.
a daily battle to sometimes be sitting at your desk and you begin to have bad thoughts or cry out of nowhere. And just for the record, when I say bad thoughts, not drug use. I mean, that's been 31 years. And geez, if I can do it one day at a time, anybody can do it.
Yeah.
You just gotta want to, and you can't do it with willpower. As Father Joseph Martin, the now deceased alcoholic priest and a great man in the treatment industry, said, when next time you have a good case of diarrhea, try willpower and see how it works.
Yeah.
Can't do it.
Right.
You gotta.
It has that much of a deep root inside of you.
It
clings onto you.
It grabs a hold of you, and only you have the power to stop. And October 19th, 1989 was the last time I picked up any of that garbage.
Wow, that's interesting. I remember that time frame in my life.
Wound up in the hospital. I had used a bunch of cocaine. I was having chest pain, arm pain. I thought I was having a heart attack. I wasn't, but I got a ride to the hospital, and it turned out it was just nothing like that. And my best friend flew up from Texas. He writes the foreword in the book. His name is Jim Epperson. And I remember the doctor said, "You need to go to treatment for 6 months." And Jim looked at him. He says, "The hell if he does. He just needs to get honest and quit using that crap." And I did. Sometimes white knuckling, but I did it.
Yeah. You talk about in your book about racism, the prevalence of racism that existed, still exists, but existed at that time in a different way, the way it manifested itself in the news media, and how people were decided not just if they were going to be hired or not, but what stories they were going to cover, based maybe essentially on presuppositions because of someone's race on their capability.
Yeah. We're here in Detroit, so I can talk. My good friend, I think he sees me as a friend, Al Allen, who reported for me at WJBK Fox 2. I love Al as a person, and he made himself into a good or a very good reporter. But Al, I think, came out of radio. I think he was not taught TV properly. About enterprising, investigating, and when I inherited him, I had some good heart-to-heart cousin talkings about how he needed to make himself better because management in the TV news business often saw wrongfully black men as garbage men.
Which means?
And they used to say that, meaning getting the garbage story, the story that we can trust you with, or the story that nobody else wants. And I would say to Al or any other black man that I worked with in other newsrooms, I don't want you to be that guy, but you need to get over my chinning bar. And Al worked his butt off and made himself into a good reporter, always a great guy.
you had your chinning bar. It was a high standard you held for people.
It was.
And is that standard been lowered nowadays, do you think, in terms of not just the capabilities, but the expectations of what a story should look like or be written as, the actual topics that we cover, the editorial process, but also the personal, I guess, the personal, individual, I guess, responsibility that a reporter should have when they're covering a story, their exceptionalism.
Yeah, well, I think every story needs a viewer benefit. So when George and Martha are at home listening to you on the radio or watching on TV, a benefit needs to resonate.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why should they watch it? And I think too many news directors in this town and other towns, they're being asked to do more with less. So they put on a lot of crap. As Walter Cronkite said back in the 60s, what's wrong with today's TV news is there's too many dump truck accidents. Mm-hmm. There are. And we have this infatuation with gas station video, someone shoplifting. That's not a news story. News is a deviance. It's what we don't expect.
And you've said this too about news. News is what we decide it is.
Yeah. As
the editorial directors and managing editors, news directors, executive producers, news anchors, and reporters, we're deciding what the news of the day is. We're in Detroit. What does Detroit look like today? What's the accurate story of Detroit?
You're right.
Are we giving that to our viewers or our listeners or our readers? So we decide what news is. Back then, you mentioned Walter Cronkite. He was even complaining about the dump truck stories back then. But there seemed to be a little bit more gravitas and also meat to news stories than there are today. It's very easy to cover those accidents.
Yeah, it's a lot of wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. I mean, look, when you're limited to a minute, 10 minute, and 20 seconds, because the viewers, their attention span is so short. I argue it's so short because so much of what we put on the air isn't good. While you should leave the audience wanting more, you've got to give them more for them to want more. So you're absolutely right.
Is there not enough respect nowadays for the viewer that they're not capable of maybe ingesting all this information? Are we just giving them easy stuff so they can swallow it and move on?
Yeah, it's like when the USA Today came out, I think I nicknamed it when I was in Chicago, the McNewspaper, because it's like going to McDonald's. And so is a lot of local news. And I think we can do better. I like features. They're important because the sky isn't falling most days. Some days it seems like it. But I think it's really important to give them something that can educate them, teach them, benefit them. In other words, when you do a murder or, God forbid, a sex assault as well, give some context, give some perspective. What are people doing for prevention? We don't do enough. I came up with the idea years ago called team reports, meaning someone does the main story and someone does the sidebar, the story behind the story. Mm-hmm. You don't ever see those anymore. There's too much worry on if a story's being run at night that ran during the day, let's update it. How do we update it? Put in the word tonight. That's not an update. It's ripping the viewers off.
I watched an old broadcast, and it was Bill Bonds, and it was the top story of the evening, I think the 11 o'clock news, and he spent a good 10 minutes on it.
Yeah.
Or so, that's what I would assume. It's a different ballgame nowadays. I want to talk about this real quickly, and then we'll close it out. But it takes a special type of person to run a newsroom and to be in a newsroom. You and your wife told me the story of the first time she walked into a newsroom in Chicago where you two met.
Yeah.
And she knew you were a news director and all these different things in Chicago, big town, but she had no idea until she walked in. She looked at you, her boyfriend at the time, saw one phone flipped on this side of your shoulder, another one over here, another one wrapped around your back, and you're on the other one, and you're barking at your reporters and producers. She was blown away by the need to multitask at such a high level.
Yeah.
But that's the craziness of a newsroom. What is it? Do you miss that? Do you like that?
I miss parts of it. I would have difficulty working in today's newsrooms because, look, If you write someone a critique of their work, they're running to HR. You discipline someone for missing their position in the show, you go to HR. So I would have difficulty, but with all the, the Donald Trump controversy, Kwame Kilpatrick going to prison, Flint water, I miss that aspect, but I would have a tough time, I think, because I consider myself tough but fair, and I think no one wants tough anymore.
What's your favorite part of the book?
Favorite part of the book to me is really my love affair with Bruce Springsteen. It really is. I've seen him 131 times, and it isn't just because of the music. It really isn't. Every time I had a tragedy in my family, it seems like he had another album coming out, and he would help get me through it. My favorite story that I ever covered and won a lot of awards for, but not that important a story, was the Tanya Harding attack of Nancy Kerrigan. I mean, not that important to the rest of the world. I mean, important stories I investigated were sex rings involving children, undercover, doctors writing prescriptions that are killing people, addicted nurses, addicted doctors, judges that were going to prison in Chicago, Operation Greylord, getting justice for a black woman in Detroit whose son was 4-year-old, kidnapped, raped, murdered, and put in the neighbor's attic, which the cops never checked because they were so convinced she murdered the kid.
Oh.
Those stories are great, but on a cleansing point, my favorite is anytime I can talk about Bruce Springsteen. Heck, my daughter named her newest child Bruce, and it's after Bruce Springsteen.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And he's still going today. You've seen him 131 times. And you had an illustrious career in the rock and roll industry, a concert promoter. And what was your favorite, aside from Bruce Springsteen and seeing him? I know you got to run.
No.
Oh, you're way late. Okay, so quick comment on that era of your life.
Bowie.
David Bowie.
Yeah, we did him 7 nights, 2 shows a night at the Michigan Palace, which still stands, but it's now a garage. The facade is up. I was told, when you're in with David, don't look him in the eye and do not talk to him unless he talks to you. And he was in many ways the Sinatra of rock and roll. One night he had a tux on, the next night he had a leotard. And I remember David Bowie going out on stage opening night, and someone throws a tomato and hits his wife, Angela. So he stopped the show. I mean, he threatened to cancel the shows. Stories like that, stories like Bill Ham, the manager of ZZ Top, demanding a case of Cristal champagne at 2 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, Mort, you don't get it, we ain't going on tomorrow night. I have to find it. Standing at a urinal in Milwaukee with Rod Stewart on my left and Ron Wood, his then guitarist, on my right, thinking, wow, is this real? And then the next night, sitting with Barry Manilow in Cincinnati and asking Barry, why do you have the Spinners on? He said, I listen to the Spinners every night before I go on. It keeps me honest. And I love that industry and getting to know people like, Springsteen, Bob Seger, and getting to see all the Beatles perform individually. And
wow.
Yeah, it was a great time, and I was a baby. I mean, I got into that business when I was 16, running it when I was 17 or 18.
So the book is Enough to Be Dangerous, and it's available when and how can people get it?
It's available now at mortmeisner.com and through Amazon, but you go to mortmeisner.com, available in the hardcover and softcover. The official release is October 1st, which I coincidentally is the anniversary of my bar mitzvah
Is it
of
really?
1966. Yeah,
That was not planned.
no, it wasn't. I hope you can come to the launch party.
I would love it. October 1st. I'll put it on my calendar.
It'd be cool.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank
Cool.
you, Mort.
Man, thank you.
Hey, my thanks to Mort Meisner for his time and his insight and for revealing some of the things in his book. It's called, again, Enough to Be Dangerous, available for pre-orders right now. You can go to his website, mortmeisner.com, and then when it's released in October, you can find it online at those online booksellers, places like Amazon and the like. Hey, don't forget to listen to WWJ News Radio 950 every weekday morning with Roberta Jacina and me, and the entire morning crew, also on radio.com. I would love your thoughts. You can find me on Twitter at Tom Jordan News. You can also find me on Facebook, Tom Jordan's Got Issues. I'm Tom Jordan, and I've got issues.